Welcome back, venturers. It's time for another discussion about VNs. I am Emar, and together with Tauros, we bring today the topic of anime adaptation of VNs. But in order to tackle this topic, we had to invite the hentai reviewer himself. Welcome back to the podcast, Adze.
Hey guys, thank you for having me on again. It's always a great time being here. As MR just said, I am Adze, and I make a lot of videos on visual novels and tangentially related media. And yeah, just recently I did review a hentai, so there's that.
Well, that's somewhat related to the topic we're getting into today of visual novels and their anime adaptations. This is a very wide, a very general topic, although there are plenty of specific visual novels and anime series we could talk about as well. So this looks to be interesting. So first off, though, I want to ask you, our guest of honor, Adze, do you prefer it more when an anime adaptation adapts the visual novel, by the letter, scene by scene, characters and all of that? Or do you prefer if they take a few creative liberties, if it means making it better?
I think it really depends for me because I think an adaptation really shines when it brings over the heart of what the original is. Why do people love this thing so much? And how can we bring it to this new medium? But at the same time, you can't just do a one-to-one necessarily because a lot of times certain things from, for example, visual novels or books, very text heavy, might not work in an anime or a movie. So it's a balancing act where you just, as long as they bring the soul of the original and do it out of respect, I can usually be happy with whatever direction they choose.
Visual novels, they're text-based primarily, so they have a few advantages and disadvantages than an anime series where it's mostly visually conveyed. So that's always a consideration. Some things, so to say, translate well, some things don't. And so I'm of the mind that I don't mind when they take creative liberties, because I'm assuming whoever's the director for the anime series knows what works best and what can be improved and what will flop on the screen instead of through the text on a VN. What do you think, Amar?
Well, I agree that some creative liberty is alright. I will give you an example. Fate. Whenever I read Fate, and there were some fights depicted in the story, I always wondered to myself, dang, I really want to see that animated. And obviously, once they did get an animation, watching those fights, those combats, those clashes was always very spectacular, even though I admit the protagonist really lost in the anime adaptation because a lot of the turmoil comes from within the inner monologue, and that is probably the weakest point of anime adaptations. But in contrary, stories that tend to have drama that depend on an action or happenstance and less so on internal monologue, like Mashiro Iro Symphony, VN to anime adaptation, I felt they did anime adaptations really well because it was all about action and things happening, not necessarily people thinking and having those, how can I say, the crisis of identity as Shiro did.
Exactly. In that ufotable adaptation of Unlimited Blade Works for Fate Stay Night, the action scenes were incredible, and it really got to sell you on how ruthless, how fast, and how agile the servants were in a way that I don't think the VN ever did. But on the flip side, they tried conveying some of Shiro's inner monologue and some of his characterization, and it did not work as well. In my opinion, I was watching it and it felt more like a slog pacing wise for how long they had to dedicate to these monologues so that we could understand him as a main character, as opposed to the visual novel where Yeah, sure, there's the info dumps, but those are still more easily digestible in a text format like that, when you can just see his inner thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to this specific example because I have not read or seen Fate. However, I think that does speak to the differences between the mediums as a whole. Something like a visual novel or a regular novel, since it's very text based, a lot of times what a good writer will do is the way a character narrates certain things can tell a lot about how they're thinking, including things that they themselves might not be aware of. However, there's usually a lot less narration in an anime or any TV show or movie, where they have to convey things more on a visual way that text-based stuff may not be able to. So, again, it's a completely different set of challenges, even if you take the adaptation element away from it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. After all, there's some VNs I've read that really utilize that 3D space, the camera work, to make it feel like I was getting the anime experience right there. Like Necrobarista was a good one. But aside from that, aside going back to that topic about original content, there's always the risk that there's some anime exclusive scene that doesn't hit the mark, where you're like, there's that messed stuff up, or that was cute but they were trying too hard, or something like that, and it ends up ruining the mood, or it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. You always have to
Or
be afraid of that blowback, though, if you're gonna try being cute like that, right?
yeah, and you have to be especially careful with that creative freedom, because you can inject something that fundamentally doesn't fit what the story was meant to convey. And probably that's the biggest danger.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is that if you're working on an adaptation, and I'm gonna say it as if it's a single person job, even though I know it's teams working in collaboration on this, but when you're adapting something, you have to realize it's not your work that's being adapted. It's someone else's story, and you're essentially bringing it to a new audience. And I think that's a fundamentally different thing than if you're making your own original story. And sometimes the wires can get a little crossed when adaptations decide to add their own stuff into it, if it's not done well.
Mm-hmm. One factor, though, that comes into mind is that visual novels are usually, well, they can be really long. And then if you consider an anime series, it's like one season of, 13 episodes. One anime episode, you realistically have 20 minutes of airtime, so a third of an hour. One season is pretty much only like 4 hours or so. And visual novels have so much more. Usually you end up cutting stuff, like routes, entire routes. You just gotta stick yourself to one heroine. And so when you think about, a director trying to add content, you don't often get those opportunities, though. A lot of times it's just trying to decide, well, what are we going to leave out? What are the non-important bits that we can afford to lose?
And then there may also be other constraints on top of that. Like, again, if you have a runtime limit where you're not really going to be able to have a second season, or there's budgetary constraints, that can also add additional pressures that I personally don't know how you would work around.
Mm-hmm. Go for it.
There's a reason why. Can I say? Given all of that, most adaptations tend to focus on like you mentioned, Tauros, a single heroine, or even pick throughout the finale or the conclusion of a story, which otherwise in a game you require maybe some unlocks, maybe completing some other routes. Probably the most famous example of that is Steingate, the title that decided to make an anime adaptation solely and only based on a true route, which isn't easy to achieve in the main game.
When you say isn't easy to achieve in the main game, Do you mean as in knowing the choices to make, or is it simply like how much of the title you have to go through to finally even start the true route?
I do believe there isn't a requirement, meaning there isn't a locked route, as in the true route isn't locked, but the choices are very strict, and there's many of them. And I believe you have to be 100% correct on your picks, otherwise you are out of the true route.
Mm-hmm. And of
I
course,
mean, assumption being is that the reader won't reach it for the first read through.
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it also works thematically with something like Steins Gate. Again, I haven't read it yet. It's on my to-do list, but it's all about time, and so the multi-route structure really does feed into that whole time travel kind of thing it's going for.
Once I remember way back in the day, I saw the Danganronpa 1 anime adaptation. And speaking of cutting time, they had to cut out all of the investigative portions. So in Danganronpa, it's there's the murder, and then you roam the school and the crime scene looking for any clues, and then it leads to the big old showdown in their little makeshift courtroom where all the theories fly and they start building up evidence and counter arguments and all of that. Like I said, the anime adaptation had to cut all of the investigative part, but when you consider how long Danganronpa is, like 30 hours or so, and then you compare it to the airtime it got, something had to go. And if you're gonna cut anything, then the investigative parts were probably the easiest parts to do that. And so even though some people bemoaned that, oh, they lost out on a lot of, quality discussions and funny moments, it's like, well, you had to cut something. It's just feasibly impossible to keep everything in the Danganronpa game, visual novel, to transfer it into a limited anime series. And so I really enjoyed, what we got out of it, especially with the whole visual aspects. Like you mentioned, you got to see a lot of characters doing silly stuff in the background. You got to see a lot of hype moments with some impressive camera work. And so, Danganronpa 1, I feel like it was a great anime adaptation. Maybe people didn't think so at the time, and of course it could be better. We had later animated Danganronpa anime series, but for what it was at the time, I really liked the first one.
Well, funny thing about cutting, because we now focus on cutting content in order to fit the frame. But I wonder how you guys feel about adapting multi-routed titles into an anime in which the anime has rewinds. Have you seen an example of that?
No, what do you mean by that?
Okay, on Yosuga no Sora, this is an anime adaptation of a VM, they set up a common route, and this is an anime that runs 12 episodes, okay? Or maybe 13, basically one season. They end up around 5 episodes to tackle the common route, so to speak, in a title that is otherwise, if I remember correctly, ladder structure, so ladder choices. After which, episode 6 is dedicated for a heroine ending, maybe even 6 and 7, but let's stick with 6. After which you get an ending, and the anime rewinds itself back to episode 5 and starts from there for episode 7, as if main character didn't meet that character and just didn't pass her the salt and just moved on, ignored her and moved on to someone else.
That's
That
hilarious.
That sounds really cool if done well.
Well, how would you do it poorly?
I mean, I think the big issue would be the runtime, just because, can you fit everything into the amount of time allotted, or are you just going to basically be doing a Cliff Notes version of each route and just kind of sacrificing all the meat there?
Oh, that is true.
this is something that is super curious to me because at that time, when I watched that anime adaptation, the VN itself hasn't been translated. And to this date, it doesn't have an official translation. But I think it was a year ago, Yosuga no Sora released a fan translation patch. So at some point, back in my backlog, I want to go and revisit that title and check, was it butchered adaptation, or maybe they found a way to sneak in a rewind system in the anime adaptation that actually works.
Because usually when you see an anime adaptation, it just takes, the main heroine's route. And a lot of, you'll be lucky if you'll see any of the other characters along the way, because there is a main focus. I've been debating if I want to mention this, but
Go ahead.
in the past, I watched the Tsukihime anime, the one that everyone jokes that does not exist. And for anyone interested, yes, it is god-awful. Everything about it is trash. It is trash as an adaptation of the visual novel. It is trash as a standalone show for anyone just joining in. It mostly followed Arcwade's route. But what's really funny is like the first 3 episodes kind of went quickly and covered like the first half of it. And then it just wandered around doing nothing for like the next 8 episodes. It kind of dipped into some of the Far Side of the Moon routes, and it kind of stuck with Ark's route, and it also put in some new material that was bad. And then like the last 2 episodes it remembered, oh crap, we have the other half of Ark's route to do, and then they just sped through the rest of that. I was very confused, but I mean, the main idea is that it followed Arquid's route because she's the main heroine and all, and then it tried shoving in key material and character development for the other heroines, but more often than not, that sort of structure feels like it just wanders into certain topics with no real attachment to it. It's just a matter of, oh, today's episode is about this side character. And of course, that's a flaw with some visual novels, but I mean, it really gets highlighted if you're looking at an anime adaptation that has all of this content and they're trying to do it all. And I don't know if that's always the best way to do it.
Yeah, it sounds like a case of, hey, the original had all these things in it. We need the adaptation to have all these things, even though they're very spread apart in the visual novel.
Because, I mean, that's the question. If you leave out all of those things, you end up with a bunch of pretty flat characters, right?
But if you want to incorporate all of those things, maybe you need a new glue to glue it all together, if that didn't happen in the same round, right?
I suppose so. Speaking of which, hey Adze, you just recently put out a video about Euphoria and its anime adaptation, right?
I did, and so much of what you were saying about Tsukihime is ringing true for me. It's like, even though you're talking about something else, I feel seen.
Oh no.
Because Euphoria is what, like a 30-hour visual novel, give or take, and it's adapted into a 6-episode anime. I mean, anime in quotation marks. And the way it kind of does things is the first 2-ish episodes focus on the first arc, and it's played pretty straight. I think it's actually done reasonably well. The 3rd episode rewinds, like MR was talking about, says, I wonder what would have happened if you picked a different choice, or something like that. And then kind of does the first arc of a different route. And then it just kind of throws shit together for the last 3 episodes, and includes a few original things that don't really make a whole lot of sense. And it's
Okay.
I don't know, it felt like I was watching almost out of morbid curiosity because I'm just like, where the hell are they even going with this? And then by the end I concluded, oh, they don't even know.
I mean, that was probably my favorite part of your video when you kept, how can I say, about episode 2, you said it peaked when it comes to faithful adaptation. From that point, it was all downhill. And at certain point, you said, you know what? I'm still engaged because I have no idea what's happening next, because this is so out of realm of possibility and things I know about this title. I wonder how they all tie it all together.
Exactly, and it was such a surreal experience because I mean I've said this in my video, but the opening scene I think is genuinely amazing. Like I think they really set the tone about as perfectly as you could. And again, then around episode 4, episode 5, they start throwing in stuff from the true route. They start swapping characters. They include some additional scenes, like at one point half the cast just gets killed off by like literally having their heads disappear, which didn't happen in the visual novel. At one point they crushed the endings of 2 routes together.
That was
And
so crazy. Yeah.
yeah.
See, the thing
I-
about the thing about the endings is that it can work if like the characters are completely unrelated. Like if in a typical moege with like multiple characters, it's like you have one character get their big emotional moment, and then you could also have another side character get their moment too. Is that what happened in Euphoria, or did like they conflict with each other?
they didn't really have any of the important parts from either of their routes in the adaptation. They just kind of skipped over about 2/3 of the story right to their ending. Well, again, not even their ending, because they literally just kind of had the 2 characters end up with the main character. And I think the entire reason they did that was so they could have them in a threesome.
Yeah. And
Aye,
if
aye,
I
aye.
were to find a relation, because that's one thing that you pointed out, Taurus, that they find commonalities on those characters to bring them together, right? And the one thing that they are related in, I would say, those 2 characters are both equally unimportant.
Oh,
That's it. Like, yeah, those are side characters.
Pretty much. I mean, they do have. They're essentially the flavor text of the visual novel, where
Yeah.
I think Natsuki, the teacher, her job was to kind of make you question what's going on in the world, whereas Rika, the other one who was in that, I think her job is to kind of, because she's the most outwardly innocent, it's more of an exploration of how, Keisuke is being forced to do all these awful things that he's finding himself enjoying. So it's kind of her route is used to kind of explore that with Keisuke. So, I mean, they don't really matter a whole lot in the meta narrative, but they do matter as far as setting the tone of the overall story.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. In the original VM, they had a role and purpose, but once you strip those things from those characters for adaptation, there's barely anything left.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I think the adaptation, aside from not having a clear direction, I think it also just didn't really. They tried to do too much because I think there's no way you can really get all of it in 6 episodes. So I mean I really think they probably, since the first arc you can kind of swap scenes around and they're almost interchangeable. So I think they could have done that and then just gone to the end of one route and left it on like a cliffhanger. That probably would have been the best way to do it.
ending on a cliffhanger for the episode or like the entire
Well,
thing?
for the, like, not necessarily a cliffhanger, like in that they don't really explain the entire thing because you need to have the true route for that, and that's its like whole other thing. You'd basically need at least a whole other season to be able to really explore that. But like, there's one ending in the visual novel where, I mean, the whole point is that Keisuke has these really dark fetishes that he suppresses, but he's put in a situation where he is forced to engage in them, so there's like this whole conflict there. And one of the endings involves him completely embracing the darkness, and I think that's probably the direction that the adaptation should have gone, because it includes things from all the entire cast, and it also is just its own ending that doesn't necessarily require the other endings to function.
Oh,
That's true. That would be very smart to use.
Yeah, I mean, it does take on a whole new dynamic when the true route is revealed, because it just completely
Yeah.
shifts everything. But
Yes,
on its own, it works.
true.
It's amazing how just a 6-episode adaptation of Euphoria can spawn a lot of interesting directions of how to take it, where to go, what the point is, what content to adapt.
Yeah, and again, I was shocked at the fact that I was actually laughing at certain points just because of how ridiculous it was. Or
Okay.
how they had a new take on probably the most disgusting scene in the visual novel, which I wasn't expecting them to adapt it at all, but they just made it into Human Centipede.
Yeah.
Oh dear, oh dear. I hope, MR, you have never been injured in such a way, seeing your beloved titles be brought to the wider audience and it just completely missed the mark. I hope you're safe from all of us, right, MR?
Today I learned during the preparation stage that Move Love anime adaptation had more than couple episodes, because that's the maximum I suffered through before I just dropped. I just couldn't.
Oh no.
Okay. The way they tackled Move Love. No.
Okay, wait, you gotta hear me out, Muplove. Are you meaning to tell me that it was not a good idea to start with an anime adaptation of Muplove Alternative, the third entry in the trilogy?
They had a creative, artistic liberty of incorporating the rest of the series as a tactical flashbacks. No, that is so wrong. No.
I mean,
I just couldn't.
You know, there are some anime series or whatever that you could implement that. You could start at the juicy stuff, and then you could have flashbacks of, you know, the innocent days back home and the happy memories and whatnot. I don't think Muv-Luv Alternative is one of those, though, because
It is not.
exactly, the Muv-Luv Extra is critical to how main character develops, to what they're fighting for, even to several of the, you know, premises of Muv-Luv Alternative. And all of that is lost out on the viewer of someone who just starts watching Muv-Luv Alternative anime.
Yeah, well, I do think that the extra saga could have been truncated. Not necessarily like a couple episodes I think would have been potentially enough. The real crime was cutting out Unlimited, because, you know, it's like a time loop story cutting out the first loop.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was watching the Muv-Luv Alternative anime, and there was one thing where I don't even remember what was going on, but Mikoto was at the forefront of it. She shows up and is going to do stuff, and then I realized there was literally no characterization of her in the anime outside of a single offhand line. So people who haven't read the original, which I was able to kind of supplement it because I knew it was going on, I knew all the extra stuff that was being skipped over, but I realized an anime only has zero clue who the fuck this person is.
And that's supposed to be a strength of anime in general. You can quickly show, you know, someone's characterization through actions. Like you mentioned, the way they walk, the way they talk about stuff, even fight scenes too. That says a lot about the characters. And dropping the ball like that, not telling the audience who this person is at all, is pretty lame.
I mean, I will say, just to play devil's advocate in their defense, I mean, I firmly believe that the reason the Muv-Luv alternative anime is the way it is because the studio was essentially given a direction from the higher ups that you got to do it from this point to this point, and they were just kind of doing the best they could. Because I think there are certain individual scenes and episodes that are actually done very well. Like, I think whenever a character is given like a speech that's taken from the visual novel, it tends to be done very well. I thought the action scenes were, for the most part, pretty good. And I also, there was the one scene with Miki and her father coming to visit the base. It was like a comedy episode. I really, really enjoyed that one. So it's like, I think it could have been good, but it just was not given the foundations to be good.
So with that said, in general, Adze, would you say you like visual novels more, or do you like visual novel anime adaptations more?
I have always been a believer that 99% of the time, the source material is going to be superior. Sometimes it's not the case, but those are rare exceptions.
Well, I, for one, didn't think I would grow into a person who says the book was better. But yeah, I loved Lord of the Rings movies, and I always cringed at people who said, "Oh, the books were better." But now I'm doing the same. No, don't watch the anime. Go back and read the visual novel, okay? And the moment, Taurus, you asked me about the disappointments, I had Muv-Luv on one hand, and on the other hand, maybe even bigger disappointment because I remember how butchered the Blaze Blue anime adaptation was. It's just like, I'd rather forget about that.
There was a
But
Blaze Blue anime adaptation?
yes, there was.
Holy crud.
The entire game has been crammed into 3 episodes, and I wept. I wept. No, it's just like, yeah, it's throughout, no characterization. Even fights from a fighting game-esque were kind of garble. So, no redeeming qualities.
I feel like if you're going to be adapting a fighting game, you have to get the fight scenes down. Like,
You'd think, right?
Yeah, the character designers for like the fighting game itself, it's like they put so much effort into the moves and the characters and the voice lines. You gotta build off that from an adaptation, right?
yeah, it's like if you watch like the Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat movies, you're not probably gonna like them, but you're like, if they get the fights down, I'm gonna be very happy.
Yeah, true.
Aye. Oh, well, that is apparently too much for us to hope for from some visual novels.
But
So sad.
I do have a question. Maybe for the end. Do you guys have a positive example of an anime adaptation which actually cut content to make it better? Because I do.
Oh, what's your example?
Should I start? Because I can. Steins 0 has the best approach because the VM had a lot of very questionable routes, but the anime adaptation just took the best parts and completely cut the stupid arcs out of existence. And that's the only example I remember when they just went in, removed the garbage, and the anime was better for it, okay?
I think I'd have to go with the Danganronpa 1 again, like I mentioned. We got so many amazing clips. And all we had to pay for it was cutting out the investigative parts, which is sad, but, you know, that's okay.
Yeah, all of my examples are actually not like visual novel related, so because I haven't actually seen a whole lot of visual novel to anime adaptations. But I mean, I will say I saw the 93 Rants OVA. I thought, it basically completely did its own thing, acted like the games didn't even exist, and I thought it was a good time.
Okay. A lot of creative freedom with a bombastic character like Rams is a recipe for a good time, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. But hey, that's a good note to end it on, like you said.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for taking part, Adze.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I know I've been on a couple times already, and it's always an absolute blast. So I appreciate you having me on again.
And it's funny enough that a topic of adaptation is something I discussed with Adze for a long time. And finally, you releasing that Euphoria review pushed us to, you know what, let's do the episode. And it was fun. It was really fun. Thank you once again for joining in. And to all our listeners, thank you again and venture out.
Venture out.